Question number 12, the Honourable David Parker.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister of Trade. Why did he say to journalists asking about the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, quote, "We need adults to do this, not breathless children to run off at the mouth"? And why does he think we should trust the government to protect New Zealand's interests when the Prime Minister has already admitted on TV that the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement may trade away New Zealand's right to ban the sale of our homes to foreigners?
Mr Speaker.
The Honourable Todd McLeay.
On behalf of the Minister, the member needs to be careful not to take the Minister's comments in isolation or out of context. Equally, that's not actually what the Prime Minister said. Mr Speaker, the government is working to get the best deal that it can for New Zealanders.
Supplementary question, the Honourable David Parker.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. What written advice has the Minister received from the Minister of Housing or that Minister's officials about the effect of foreign buyers on Auckland house prices?
Mr Speaker.
The Honourable Todd McLeay.
Mr Speaker, on behalf of the Minister, I'm not aware of all of the advice the Minister has received from all other ministers in their portfolio areas. But what I can say, Mr Speaker, is that in as far as TPP is concluded, it's not yet agreed, it's still a negotiation, and the outcome of this agreement, should it be reached, will depend upon the circumstances around the policy the member is suggesting.
Supplementary question, the Honourable David Parker.
Given that National doesn't know how big the effect of foreign buyers is on house prices, how can he look New Zealanders in the eye and say he's correct to trade away New Zealand's right to ban foreign buyers?
Mr Speaker.
The Honourable Todd McLeay.
Mr Speaker, on behalf of the Minister, because the Minister is not going to go out and single out one group of New Zealanders who have unusual sounding names to members opposite and stigmatise them as far as housing policy is concerned.
Order.
Supplementary.
Supplementary question, the Honourable David Parker.
Why does that Minister imply that it's racist to talk about foreign buyers from China, but never makes the same accusation when we talk about foreign buyers from the USA under the TPP?
Mr Speaker.
Honourable Todd McLeay.
Mr Speaker, on behalf of the Minister, that's not what I said. What I said was that some of the worst policy development I've seen in the history of this Parliament from Mr Twyford and his cronies.
Supplementary question, the Honourable David Parker.
Does he believe New Zealand should be able to control whether overseas buyers should be allowed to buy New Zealand homes?
The Honourable Todd McLeay.
Mr Speaker, on behalf of the Minister of Trade, that's not actually policy that falls within his competence.
Point of order, Mr Speaker.
Point of order, the Honourable David Parker.
Given that it's absolutely central to the negotiations of the TPP, as we've heard about in this House for months, how can the Minister deny that he hasn't got responsibility for whether he protects that?
Order. I think in view of where the supplementaries have gone and where the answers have been given, I'm going to invite on that basis the member to ask that question again. The Honourable David
Speaker,
Parker.
Does he believe New Zealand should be able to control whether overseas buyers are allowed to buy New Zealand homes?
The Honourable Todd McLeay.
Mr Speaker, on behalf of the Minister of Trade, that's not actually an area that falls within the competence of trade. The government has a number of tools available to it around policy that can have an effect upon housing policy.
Point of order, Mr Speaker.
If the member's now going to say the question hasn't been addressed, we've now tried it twice. If that doesn't address the question, may not be to the satisfaction.
No, sir, my point of order is that how can he deny responsibility? He denied responsibility for answering the question, saying it was outside his ministerial responsibility. Given that he's negotiating that very issue, how can he deny responsibility?
The way forward is not to... the question's been addressed, obviously not to the satisfaction of the member. The way forward is further supplementaries. That concludes question... supplementary question, the Honourable David Parker.
Why does he call his critics ideologues, tell journalists that they're breathless children, and expect New Zealanders in the dark to trust him when he's already shown that he's the ideologue by selling out New Zealanders and giving up the right to ban the sale of overseas houses to foreigners?
The Honourable Todd McLeay.
Mr. Speaker, on behalf of the member needs to be careful not to take the minister's comments out of context or to put meaning in them he didn't intend. In as far as his involvement with the TPP negotiations is concerned, his ideology is to deliver the very best agreement he can for New Zealand.
And that concludes. Point of order, the Honourable Ron Mark.
Mr. Speaker, I need to draw to your attention that there is information now on the media airing that you, yourself, sir, swore at the leader of my party under your breath and it was caught on the microphone. Given the consistency in the way in which we have been treated over here, do you not think you should withdraw and apologise?
I absolutely assure the member I never did such a thing. I call on government order of the day, number 1.